Now, in 5:17 through 48, Jesus talked about how we interpret the law. The law was this thing that gave structure to the theology, if you want to call it that, of God's people at the time. They didn't do theology in the way that we do in the West today. But the law was what helped them think about what it means to be part of God's family. But now in chapter 6, Jesus turns his attention to the way that piety was practiced, the way that people expressed their devotion to God in their daily lives. And that's what we want to look at this morning and next week. Now, this morning we're going to look at all of the topics that Jesus addresses, and next week we're going to use the model prayer to zoom in on one of those expressions of piety. Now let's begin by setting the stage for this new movement in Jesus' sermon. And the first thing I want us to observe is that in truth, Jesus is addressing the same question that he addressed in chapter 5, verses 3 through 20. He is addressing the question, what is the pathway to a life that is blessed by God? And behind that question is another question, kind of lurking in the background. Because you see, to be blessed by God is also to be approved by God. So in a very real sense, Jesus is also asking the question, what does it mean to be approved by God? Now, I didn't put this on your outline, and in fact, it didn't occur to me until basically just about 5 minutes ago. But Jesus is also doing something else, and it's something that he's doing in anticipation of what we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks. The second half of chapter 6. We as a society, as divided and polarized as we are, live in the shadow of fear. We're afraid of our politicians. We're afraid of each other. We're afraid of our past. We're afraid of the future. And it's quite clear that Jesus is dealing in the second half of chapter 6 with that kind of fear. I mean, after all, he tells the people over and over again, do not worry. But in a sense, he's doing the same thing in the first half of chapter 6. He is bringing to the surface those things that we worry about. We'll talk about what those are in just a moment. Think about it this way. What is it that you're really concerned with? What is it that you're really worried about, and how do you find out what it is? Well, think about what occupies your attention. What shapes your behavior, especially when the pastor's not looking. That's part of what Jesus wants to address. Now, this is on your outline. We want to think carefully about the tone that we impart to Jesus here in chapters 6, verses 1 through 18. Why is that? Well, I think I've shared with you before that 93% of communication doesn't have anything to do, or much to do, with the actual words that you use. It's your voice inflection, that's 38% of it, and your nonverbal communication, gestures, your facial expressions, your eyes. That's 55% of it. Well, we don't have any of that with Jesus. But our minds are wired for that. So what do? We fill in the blanks from what we think we know about Jesus and from what little bit of contextual cues we get from whatever it is that we're reading. Now, the problem is that we've just been reading some really challenging passages where Jesus takes the law and radicalizes it, makes it even harder to fulfill. And in that context, you could be excused if you read 6, 1 through 18 as kind of being like Jesus wagging his finger and saying, "Bad dog. You're a bad, bad, bad dog. And you need to stop doing whatever it is," right? But what if that's not his tone? What if instead of a finger-wagging lecture, what if Jesus is instead coming alongside the people in the crowd and bringing to their attention things that they have always known are wrong, but they just didn't have the words to express what was wrong and why it was wrong? Have you ever been in one of those situations where you're just you're looking at a social situation, you're looking at a relationship, you're looking at, who knows, maybe even a piece of legislation or a piece of church policy or something, and you're looking at it and something just isn't right about it, but you can't put your finger on it. And then somebody comes along and they put their finger on it. And you go, "Oh, that's it." What if that's the tone Jesus is taking? How would that change the way that we receive his instruction here? How would that help us think more clearly about what it is that he's trying to say? And then in our final bit of stage setting here, we want to notice what at first might seem to be a contradiction in Jesus' own logic. If you'll remember, in 5:14 through 16, Jesus says, "Let your light shine before people, so that they may see your good works." But then here in 6:1, he says, don't let people see your acts of righteousness. Don't do your acts of righteousness before others, before people. Now, is Jesus contradicting himself in the space of just a few minutes? No. How do we know? Because of the modifying clauses that he puts in each of these verses. In 5:14 through 16, notice it's, "Let your light shine before people so that they may see your good works and," here's the purpose clause, "glorify your Father who is in heaven." That's one purpose, right? By contrast, notice what he does in chapter 6, verse 1. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of people in order to be seen by them. Completely different purpose, right? It's those purpose statements that help us differentiate what Jesus is trying to say. They help us understand how it is that Jesus isn't contradicting himself. He's actually kind of, now his logic does kind of fold back, so to speak, but he's still kind of pursuing the same agenda. It's not about you or me, it's about the Father. Okay? Now, we're going to have occasion to come back to that in just a moment here. All right, so now that we've set the stage, let's look at what Jesus is actually talking about here. I've called these the 3 pillars of Jewish righteousness, and that's how scholars think of them. In the first century, Jewish piety, I should say the pillars of Jewish piety. Jewish piety was practiced in this way. It was practiced through the giving of money to the poor, through prayer, and through fasting. That's what you did on a daily basis to communicate your devotion to God. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to walk through each of these. And it's not going to be as dense as it looks. Okay? But we're going to walk through each of them, explain their purposes, and then talk about what it is that Jesus is critiquing. So let's begin with giving to the poor. This is an underutilized spiritual discipline, I would argue, among Christians. But for Jews, it was vitally important. Why? Well, from a social point of view, they did not have a social safety net. The only social safety net was family. And if your family wouldn't or couldn't support you and you fell on hard times, you had nothing. Absolutely nothing. And so, people begged. That's what they had to do. Now, the thing is, though, this is a spiritual discipline. It also has a spiritual purpose. There's no specific text that Jesus is quoting or referring to here, but everybody in the crowd understood that whenever they gave to the poor, they were remembering that what they had did not belong to them. It was a gift from God. Right? By the way, that's what giving to the poor does for us. It helps us to remember. It helps us to remember that our money, our house, our land, our car, our books, our cows, none of it is owned by us. It is all a gift of God. So how could you corrupt something so noble as giving to the poor? Well, Jesus shows us. Here's how you do it. You go out and you make a big stage production of it. Why? Why is that such a bad thing? Because the practice ceases to be about God. It ceases to be about the poor people that we're benefiting. It is about us. And when that happens, the practice itself loses its power. It loses the inherent joy that comes with it. Some of you have done mission trips where you've worked with impoverished people in far-flung places. And again, what people say when they go on these kinds of trips is, I got more out of it than they did. There is an inherent goodness to this kind of action. But that goodness is undermined when we are constantly obsessing over how others see us. Now, of course, everybody in Jesus' audience knew exactly what he was talking about because they had seen it done. And they knew why people did it. This was an honor-shame culture. We've talked about that before. They valued public esteem more than anything. What do we value more than anything? It's an interesting question. And how might that corrupt our spiritual practice? Let's take one more shot at sort of illustrating the point that Jesus is trying to make here. Imagine that all of a sudden somebody dumps a whole dump truck load of money in your lap, and you decide, you know what? I'm going to go buy me a brand new BMW. Now we know Roy's not going to do that because he wouldn't be able to tinker with it. You know, what's the fun? Well, yeah, he might ruin it, but what's the fun if you can't tinker with it, right? But you go out and you buy you a brand new BMW, but here's the thing, you actually don't like to drive. You're just buying it so that the neighbors will see you with it. Well, anybody who's a real car enthusiast would say, you've just ruined the experience. You can't enjoy the exhilaration of driving a carefully crafted luxury car because you're too busy worrying about what the neighbors think. So that's the issue that Jesus is driving at here. Now, what about prayer? Prayer, of course, we're going to talk about again next week, but Jesus addresses it here too. Prayer has this very easy to understand social function. It's how we come into the presence of God. It's how we make our requests known to Him. It's how we connect with Him. It's how we bond with Him. But prayer also has a social function. It's why we pray in corporate worship, because prayer also binds us to one another. It creates a we, a social identity that is constructed around our devotion to God. But that also makes it extremely easy to corrupt. Jesus cites the same problem with prayer that He does with giving to the poor. We do it for the wrong purpose. Now, you've seen this happen before, okay? I'm sure, at least for some of you, you've been in a church once or more when you've seen somebody stand up and give this really eloquent prayer, and you think to yourself, well, golly, I didn't know they had that in them. That's not how they were talking last night. You know? They're just doing it for show, and it ruins the experience for everybody else. But the thing is, we can all be tempted to this. I have a friend from First Baptist Church of Arlington who likes to describe people like me as paid professional holy people. And, if you're a paid professional holy person, you're supposed to be good at public prayer, right? And I can think back, going all the way back to my time in seminary, and I would be, doing public prayer, and occasionally I would catch my mind wandering to, well, I wonder if this is reflecting well upon me. Now, it's not that I would ever actually think those words, but that's what was going on up here. I was worrying about, was I living up to my identity as this paid professional holy person? We can all be tempted that way. It reminds me of, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago. JJ and Dave Heller were talking on a recent podcast about the desire to impress people, to be seen as impressive. And that desire lurks within all of us, especially those of us who have public vocations. But Jesus also cites an additional problem here. Sometimes we do prayer with the wrong purpose, but sometimes we do it with the wrong method. Now, Jesus is citing a well-known practice among Gentiles of his day. They were not worshipers of Israel's God, and sometimes they would recite long prayers with very precise formulas to try to get the gods to do what they wanted. Do we ever do that? Do we ever try to use verbal gymnastics to impress God with our erudition, with our spiritual maturity? One problem Jesus points out here is we're trying to impress others. The others we're trying to impress God. And in both cases, we're trying to manipulate somebody else into thinking we're better than we are. Or at least we're trying to get them to see the side of us that we want them to see. And in God's case, we're hoping we get some goodies out of it. Now, what about this third practice, the practice of fasting? We're Baptists, and that means we're professionals at feasting, not fasting. But fasting is an important spiritual discipline. Our Jewish forefathers practiced it. Our Christian forefathers practiced it. And if you're able, it's something we ought to do today too. Now, some people who are diabetic or who have other health-related issues are not able to do it. And I'm not able to do it like I used to be able to do it. But it is still a good practice. Fasting simply means abstaining from something that you enjoy. So it's most often food, but it might be video games, it might be television. There are lots of things that you can use this sort of fasting principle with. Now, what is the social, or in this case, also the emotional function of fasting? Well, Jesus tells us what that is. Not here, but in Matthew chapter 9. Fasting expresses our grief that the world is not as it should be. Now, sometimes that grief has a very particular reason. We're fasting because something horrible has happened, and we're trying to make sense of it, and we're trying to invite God into that traumatic experience for healing or deliverance. But sometimes we just do it because the world is a hard place. And when we fast, we are testifying to the fact that the world is not as it should be. And by the way, we're also connecting with those sympathizing with those, showing solidarity with those who are experiencing the poverty and heartbreak of our world. Fasting has a spiritual function. It teaches us, it trains us, really is what I should say, in the practice of self-discipline. Now, look, there's nothing inherent about fasting that says you have to fast to do the Christian life well. But what fasting does is it gives you practice in the kind of self-denial that really does help you do the Christian life well. It's a laboratory for you to practice. But all of that is undone if we fast so that other people know that we're fasting. It's the same problem Jesus has pointed out with giving to the poor and with prayer. You know, we come to church one morning with our hair uncombed and our glasses askew, and so what's wrong with you? Oh, I'm fasting. The Lord showed me I need to fast, and so I'm fasting. Yeah. We're trying to prove to people that we are spiritual people. That's not what fasting is for. That's not what fasting is about. So how do we take all of this and pull it together in a way that makes sense? Because if you've been reading our verses along the way, you might be kind of thinking to yourself, oh, hey, wait a minute, are we supposed to never pray in public? That'd be kind of hard, since so many of our worship services are about prayer, and since Jesus himself prayed in public. How do you actually not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, especially if you need both hands? I mean, I've never had so much money that I could hand over money with both hands, but boxes of food, that kind of thing, you might have to use both hands. No, look, Jesus is using hyperbole and other figures of speech to help us understand the kind of life that he's calling us to. And the first principle that we want to take to heart is that spiritual disciplines are just part of the life of discipleship. They just are. By the way, we as Baptists are not very good at this whole spiritual disciplines thing. But there are people who can help us. Dallas Willard has written a couple of books, maybe 3 books even, on spiritual disciplines. Adele Calhoun is a more recent writer that has written a comprehensive volume of, here are some of the spiritual practices you can do. And there's a lot of them. But all of them play a role in different people's lives. Some of them won't work for different people. But they all can play a role in our lives. Some of them are private. Some of them are public. Some of them we do together as a congregation. But they all have a role in our lives. Now, the second principle is we have to use these disciplines as directed, so to speak. If we don't, it short circuits their effectiveness. Now, what do I mean by that? Before he died, Dallas Willard was interviewed by Christianity Today, and he was very happy that people were talking about spiritual formation. He was very happy that people were thinking about these spiritual practices that make the Christian life better, that help us come close to God. But what he was concerned about was that people were using these spiritual practices for all kinds of purposes. Some of them noble, some of them maybe not so much. People were touting meditation and controlled breathing and solitude and a lot of different practices for a whole range of psychological and other maladies. And Willard's point was, you don't do it for those purposes. You do it to get closer to God. That's why you do it. And when we're not doing that, we're sort of violating the nature of these practices. And our third principle is that God isn't going to overrule that process. He's not going to make it go right when we're using it for the wrong for the wrong purpose. And then fourth, and I think this is where the real money is. Simplicity, authenticity, and humility should characterize the way that we practice our spirituality. Simplicity, authenticity, and humility. Now, the first two are pretty self-evident. Simplicity. We don't need to complicate our prayer life or our other spiritual practices, fasting, whatever it might be. Now, that doesn't mean that you can then use these criteria to judge other people, because there are some people that they've been practicing simplicity in prayer for a long time, and when they stand up and pray publicly, their prayers are artful and sophisticated and nuanced precisely because they began in a place of simplicity and God has been building them up. It's not artificial, it's authentic. Authenticity, we're just praying, fasting, doing whatever it is that we're doing for God's purposes and with our real selves. We're not pretending to be something that we're not. Humility, now that's where it gets a little more complicated. But the heart of humility is setting aside our worries about ourselves, our concerns about how people view us, our obsession with promoting ourselves. Humility is about laying all of that down and just being focused on God, being focused on others, being focused on love. That's what this is about. That's what we're talking about here. And Jesus, when he says all of this to the people, I can only imagine that some of them in the crowd were kind of nodding. Yes, yes. This is what's wrong at my local synagogue. This is what's wrong with my crazy uncle. This is what's wrong with whoever. And it's good for us to notice those things and to see Jesus coming alongside us and pointing out the things that we already know. But we need to remember that he's doing so in part to also point out where we can do things better, where we can serve our God more faithfully, loving him in a more authentic, more humble, simpler way. Let us pray.